realized the moment I fell into the fissure that the book would not be destroyed as I had planned. It continued falling into that starry expanse of which I had only a fleeting glimpse. I've tried to speculate where it might have landed. I must admit, however, such conjecture is futile. Still, questions about whose hands might one day hold my Myst book are unsettling to me. I know my apprehensions might never be allayed, and so I close, realizing that perhaps the ending has not yet been written.
I'm not much of a fan of point-and-click games. I'd say it's one of the genres I've played the least, and admittedly I've never even so much as sat down to completely finish one. Despite that, the moment I started Myst, I was immediately intrigued. Myst begins simply, and I think that's why it works so well. Left to our devices, we explore the mysterious island with little to no direction. Various tools, mechanisms, and other objects are the points of interest. By interacting with things we can't yet solve, we set about trying to understand them. We don't have the means necessary yet to solve these puzzles, or maybe a better way of putting it is the knowledge. Myst, rather than taking a focus on searching for key items, makes the player grapple with its world to understand how it operates. There's no string of objects needed to complete the game. In fact, right now the game can be beaten in less than a minute. Though it's not something you can simply stumble upon, the game doesn't stop us from being able to do it once we do have the required information. I think that sense of freedom is what sets Myst apart from other puzzle games. The gameplay doesn't come from where to use something, but how to use it at all. That feeling immerses the player as they feel more a part of the world they are playing in, as if it's a living, functioning thing. The world and its puzzles have a purpose, and they've been left there by someone to be understood by us. This style is complemented well by its controls. There's no inventory, and the HUD, rather than minimalistic, is entirely non-existent. Clicking is all we need to interact with things, or to turn the camera. Controls are often an overlooked part of a point-and-click game, but it can't be understated how this simple, intuitive system works to create the world of Myst. At its best, it can be described as unintrusive, which was exactly its goal. It is also incredibly easy for a person with very little computer skill to grasp, as the target audience for Myst would be a game that anyone could enjoy. After exploring the island a bit, we come to a small library at its center. The shelf is full of burned books, though some of them are intact. There are also two peculiar books on either side of the room. I'm going to talk about these books a bit later. For now, let's focus on this picture on the wall. We can rotate a line around the picture. Aligning it with different areas causes it to turn red. But only some of the areas are visible. As I've explored the island, I've noticed there's switches placed everywhere. Maybe these have to do with the map. When I play with the switches, I've noticed that it changes which areas are visible on the map. Not exactly sure though if up or down on the switches shows them, but after checking them, I realized that up is on. With that realization, I flipped all the switches up, and we can now see every area on the map, though we still don't know the purpose for it. You may not realize it, but what we just did was solve a puzzle. Through trial and error and good observation, we gained an understanding of how the switches interact with the map. This was simple and intuitive, and what Rand and Robin Miller, the two creators of Myst, would call a non-arbitrary puzzle. This is a core concept to the design behind the puzzles in Myst, and one of the things which makes many of the puzzles very unique. The essence of this concept is the idea that a puzzle should not only not look like a puzzle, but also not feel like a puzzle. It should smoothly integrate into the game's world, rather than being an obvious logic problem. that doesn't seem to make much sense other than to impede the player's progress, which describes the overwhelming majority of puzzles in games. As we go through the game, I'll point out more examples of this in puzzles that succeed and fail at this concept. So with that, we've rotated the tower so it aligns with a place on the map. There are a few other paintings on the walls in this room. One, if we interact with, will open up a secret passage behind the bookcase. The hallway to the elevator has some heavily contrasting lighting. It's eerie and sets the mood for the following area, which is one of my favorite in the game. The Miller brothers originally didn't want the game to have any sort of music, as they felt it would take from the realistic atmosphere they wanted. However, when their distributor asked them to put some in, the brothers agreed to it on the condition that they could do it themselves. They set out to prove to them that the game wouldn't work well with it. In a turn of irony, after creating the soundtrack, they ended up convincing themselves how effective the music actually was. Let's let it speak for itself, and you decide if you think it was a good decision. The echo tapping of metal has a methodical steadiness to it, giving an almost calming effect. When the flute comes in, we get a sense of mystery and intrigue. We're in a large metal dome, on an island that's completely devoid of all people, and I think this track really nails the atmosphere, and personally, it really sucks me into the game. We'll see in the other areas this balance between ambient background noise and realistic sounds that almost feel as if they're coming from the environment itself. This, balanced with silence and natural ambient sounds like the birds and wind, is a combination that many games, not just Myst, use. It's an immersive combination, and it's very effective in a game with a lot of isolation. Back to the room itself, from one side we can see through a slit part of the island below. Here we can see a peculiar tree which sticks out from the rest. Moving around to the other side, we see a plaque with a key, and above it a few numbers without context. If we point the tower on the map below, different things will appear on this plaque. Moving back down to the library, let's talk a little about these red and blue books. On the ground near the planetarium at the start of the game is a letter. In it, someone named Atris writes to someone named Catherine. It tells us to count the number of switches on the island and use it in the forechamber near the dock. When we get there, all we have to do is input the numbers into this little panel, and we get a cutscene with Atris in all its FMV glory.
Catherine, my love, I have to leave quickly. Something terrible has happened. It's hard for me to believe. Most of my books have been destroyed. Catherine, it's one of our sons. I suspect Achenar, but I shouldn't leap to conclusions. I'll find him and Cirrus as well.
Atris goes on to explain that he's placed the remaining books in the places of protection, and to use the tower to get the access keys. Going back to the library, let's look at the two books again. Putting the pages next to the books into them lets us get a cutscene.
Why? Bring me a red. I am serious. Serious? Bring blue pages. I must have the blue page.
So if you haven't figured it out yet, these two characters are the sons Atris talked about. The man in the red book, who looks like a very familiar comrade, is Cirrus, and the man in the blue book, who looks like a hobo, is Achenar. Without giving anything away, let's talk a bit about the plot. When they made Myst, the Miller brothers wanted to create a game for mature audiences. One of the things they wanted was the game to have an ethical question that the player has to answer. Atris suspects one of his sons burnt the books in his Myst library, and it's up to us to figure out which one we think has done it. There are hints throughout the game which we'll put together to see which one we think is guilty, which we'll talk about more in depth as we go along. So with that, let's go use the numbers we got from the tower. Our hint is that what the tower is pointed at is related to whatever we find on the plaque. But all I can find in the direction it was pointed was the small cabin we explored earlier. Here we find a boiler, a valve, and a picture of a tree trunk. Behind us is a safe with a 3-digit combination, which it turns out we can open with the numbers on the plaque. The devs keep with the intuitive controls here, having us slide the match on the side of the matchbox to light it. Then all we have to do is hover over this spot on the machine to light the boiler. Turning the valve will now give it heat. But we really have to do it so many times to get it working at a reasonable pace. Now we can hear a loud sound playing. Walking around outside, I can't find the source of the sound. It turns out there's a small path hidden near the cabin. This is a sort of visual trick that works best in pre-rendered games. Without the developers controlling the camera, this hidden area would be extremely easy to spot, so it's a clever technique to hide something from the player. We can actually see this tree from the tower earlier as well, which would be our initial hint. We can see it opening on the tree if we stand below it, so maybe we have to lower the tree to get inside it. After turning the valve 1,000 times again in the opposite direction, the tree begins to lower, and with some lenient timing, we can hop in as it goes down. Finally, after all that work, we can make our way to the first linking book, which will take us to our first area, the Channelwood Age. With the sound of frogs and the narrow wooden pathways, it looks like we're in a swamp. The fog is dense here, much more than on Myst Island, and the water much muddier. The graphics show their age a bit here, with the sound of the water hitting the bridges not being reflected visually. It's just completely still. Pipes line the path, and these small little valves are at each intersection, though I can't tell what they do just yet. There's what looks to be a generator, though pulling this lever doesn't do anything. Same story with these wooden lifts. Let's go towards the big windmill in the distance, as it seems like it's the most obvious landmark. Up here is a water tank, along with a machine that looks like the ones we've seen below. Towards the back of the windmill are 2 pipes that go down into the water. We can see that the water is probably being funneled into the tank from this machine. Below is a curious spigot. Let's try turning it. Going back down to the bottom levels, nothing seems to have changed. The engine doesn't work, and neither does the lift. So next, let's try to fiddle with these things on the pipes. Don't know exactly what they do, so I'm just pushing them in random directions until something clicks. Pretty obvious that I need the water from the tank to somehow power these things. But it's not apparent to me which way I need to turn the valves to get that to happen. As I was messing around with the valves and moving about, something caught my ear. The sound of flowing water can be heard when water is being siphoned through a pipe. Whereas, if it's not, we don't hear anything. So from this discovery, I've learned that when we push the valve towards a pipe, the pipe is being closed off, meaning the water flows in the direction opposite of the way we push the valve. With this information, all we have to do is adjust the valves to lead the water where we want it. This is one of the better puzzles in the game. I particularly like how everything can be understood intuitively by looking at the environment. The sound cue to figure out that the water is being pumped is clever too and requires good perception. It fits very nicely into the level as well. It would make sense that people surrounded by water would want to harness it somehow and use it. With that, we've supplied power to the lift and can now access the second level. While we explore, let's talk a little bit about the books that I skimmed over on Myst Island. You remember, some of the books on the bookshelf are burned, but 4 of them are not. The books were written by Atris and correspond to each of the ages we visit as we play through the game. In them, he details his explorations, giving us background behind them and what type of people may have lived there. The Channelwood book begins with Atris being found by monkey-like people, who lead him to their village, high above the water. He records the water mysteriously shifting colors from blue to orange to clear. People take him to their monkey leader, who sits atop a throne. Next to him sat a very old human who is the last of his kind in this age. This human is the only one that Adris can talk to, as he's the only one who speaks his language. He begins to explain to him the history of the island. Humans and monkey people lived in harmony on the island, the monkeys living high above in the trees, and the humans far below on the ground. However, after some sort of seismic activity, the humans supposedly sacrificed themselves in some manner to stop the island from sinking completely. The monkeys developed a sort of religious attitude towards the remaining humans, worshipping them as saviors and seeing them as their gods. Atris doubts the authenticity of this account. The man seems to truly believe everything that happened. After telling him these things, he tells Atris, "We had expected you to come sooner," then proceeds to jump to his death. His body was carried to the end of the pier where they doused and lit his corpse on fire in some sort of strange funeral. This also caused the water around the man to turn to a dull green. The following morning, Atris noticed that the green color had spread to the water as far as he could see. And it's worth noting as well that the water remains this color even now as we explore the area. The color of the water changing seems to suggest some truth to the fact that the human had some sort of power, though it's never made entirely clear. Since the monkeys have their own language, which the humans had to learn, their interpretation of the humans saving the island may have been nothing more than a misunderstanding. They saw the humans dying, and perhaps due to their primitive intelligence, saw them as sacrificing their lives to save them. There's a lot of interesting things to speculate on in Channelwood. There's no trace of the monkey people Atris talks about in his book. Much of what's left is in disarray, so it's clear something happened here. One interesting detail is the wind. If we listen on the second floor, we can hear it very clearly. The generator which pumps the water is connected by a pipe, which leads to the windmill above it. An interesting theory, I think, could be that the windmill was something made by the humans. The island was sinking, and the windmill which the humans made gave the monkeys the power to continue climbing, avoiding death. Maybe it could somehow be related to why the monkeys felt the humans were their saviors. The book, however, says that the monkeys used rope ladders to climb, and the water moving around to power the lifts makes a better puzzle. So it may have been purely for gameplay purposes, but nevertheless, it's fun to speculate. There's also a spot on the first floor where we can see some broken boards that look a bit discolored. It could be that this is the pier that the man was burned on, but again, it's just speculation. Back to the second floor, we take one more lift to the final floor. The first room we can enter plays an interesting cutscene. Alright then. There's some kind of device in the center. Looks pretty violent, though I don't get its purpose. There are also these weird faces on the wall. I'm only now realizing this actually, but these faces are very clearly human in nature. Moving on, we find a room that's very barren. Either everything was taken out of the room, or the person who lived here lived very frugal. There's a blue page on the ground and a device in the corner, which plays some more weird roleplay videos. What the hell is his problem? If you can't tell, this is the same hobo we saw in the blue book, Akinar, and we're presumably in his room right now. Seems like Akinar has been learning the language of the monkeys. I think it's suggested that maybe using this device to project himself, like in the room we saw a few seconds ago, that he's maybe trying to intimidate them or something. We also get a cutscene from Cirrus here as well, hinting to the player to only take one page.
I'm not erasing anything important, am I? Remember, he is preparing. Take only one page, my dear brother.
This is actually one of the most confusing cutscenes in the game, because even after completing the game, I have no idea who Cirrus is even talking about. More interesting is Cirrus's room, which has some subtleties and hints about it. A few broken chairs and wine bottles lay scattered on the ground, so something must have happened here. On the table, we see what looks to be a very old piece of cheese, completely molded, so we know that the area has been abandoned for some time. The visual design here is very impressive, even all these years later. The room really keeps with the more primitive theme of the area, while still giving a feeling of luxury and extravagance. There's just a lot of detail to take in, from the engravings on the door to the intricate floor and wall designs, along with these interesting spiked holders for the lamps around the room. There's also this thematic green that lines all of the furniture. We can even see it on Cirrus's plate, just giving everything that extra touch of refinement, which is all an insight into his character. Though graphically dated, the style and attention to detail of some of the rooms in Myst are still very impressive to this day. There are a few points of interest in the room. A half sheet of paper gives a hint to using the switches back on Myst Island in some way. We'll come back to this later. In a drawer near the window, we can find another page. However, this one is red. There's something else interesting in this drawer, the ink bottles. This may go unnoticed to many players, as it did on my initial playthrough, so let me explain. As I said earlier, the waters of this age used to change colors. After the last human's death, the monkeys began to treat Atris like they treated the man before him, showing him great hospitality, and pretty obviously too, seeing him as a divine being of some sort. Atris brought his sons here, which were treated like this as well. At one point, they gave Atris some inks which he uses to write in his journal. The ink changes to different colors, blue, red, and green, the same colors the water changes to. The water is described as orange, but it's not a stretch to say that this can easily be interpreted as red as well. Atris says the creatures laughed and howled upon seeing the inks change color, and he interprets it as nothing more than some sort of joke by them. But is it really? This leaves many unanswered questions. The inks are pretty clearly special in some manner. Are they imbued with some sort of power? And why does Cirrus have them? How is it related to the humans? And if they do have some sort of magical power, then does that mean that the humans really did save the island? There's no clear answer, and it's up to the player to decide what they think it all means. After choosing the page we want to take with us, we can return to the bottom floor where we have to do a bit more moving around with the pipes. We supply some water to fix the pipe, and then one to a last lift. It takes us to a book, which finally returns us to Myst. Now that we're back on Myst Island, we can put the pages in the book to see what the brothers have to say. We have a few interesting details we found in Channelwood, like the scattered bottles and whatever this little sacrificial device looks like. But nothing super concrete against either brother. Neither of them have much interesting to say, but we do get a little bit of hints as to what may have been going on here, with each brother warning against helping the other.
Now listen to my brother. Bring me the blue pages. The red ones. Don't bring the red ones. I've been wrongfully imprisoned. You must. I will have my retribution. Please bring me the blue pages.
And here's what Cirrus has to say.
My brother. And I wrongfully imprisoned. Bring the red page to me.
To say, Cirrus is kind of striking me as a much more civilized fellow for sure. Ankanar kind of rambles on like an incoherent drunk, but, we shouldn't judge a book by its cover. As the last remaining citizen of Myst, it's kind of my duty to at least give a fair, unbiased trial here. Neither of the brothers seem to like each other, so clearly one of them is up to no good. I don't feel there's much to go off of at this point though, so I'm gonna say I'm neutral between the two for now. After using the pages, we can once again use the tower to get another key from the plaque. One thing I will say is after we learn how to use it, there's not really much else to figure out. The puzzle has pretty much run its course, and the rest of Myst Island puzzles are pretty uninteresting, I'd say. plaque says 59 volts, so I guess we need that much to power the generator on the island. Long story short, we press some buttons until they add up to 59, and that lets us get inside the spaceship. Once we're inside, there's a piano and a bunch of sliders that make different sounds. This puzzle again is fairly lazy, as all we have to do is go to Atris's book for this age. Here at the very end is a diagram of the piano with a bunch of numbers. All we have to do is match each sound with a slider. So the piano sound for number 1 goes on the first slider. Piano sound for the second number goes to the second. You get it. This isn't really much of a puzzle as it is just tedious, but it has one redeeming feature which I'll bring up later. After we input the sounds, we gain access to another linking book, which will take us to this new unnamed age. As soon as we leave the spaceship, we're immediately met with some of probably the worst aging graphics in the game. Textures stretch really far across the mounds and hills, making them look really pixelated and blocky. The area is very wide open, but we can barely see anywhere in front of us. The mist is extremely thick, which was probably a workaround to avoid having to fully render everything for each shot. In Atris's book on the age, he talks about how on his initial visit, the land was much greener, but after eruptions from the earth, it became almost barren. There's not much else to talk about, as most of what Atris wrote has completely disappeared. There isn't any trace of civilization in this age, unlike the other ones. Just Atris's constructions as he tried to explore it for resources. In that sense, it does make it much less interesting to me, as it lacks any sort of depthful lore or mystery. The two brothers' pages are just strewn about with no particular reasoning throughout the level, it feels like, which also feels lazy. There is one interesting lore tidbit, however, though it's more of a trivia. The notes in Atris's book having disappeared do have an explanation, relating back to the inks we talked about in Channelwood. Chronologically, when Atris comes to this age, it takes place after he had visited Channelwood, as he states returning to it after he is finished here. We already know the water changed between blue, green, and red, but there's also a fourth color, clear. Using the clear ink Atris wrote in his book, and after some time, the writing disappeared. I don't really know if this has any sort of implication or meaning. It feels honestly a bit random. So it makes me wonder if the developers just used this as a convenient excuse as they didn't have time to finish the age. But anyways, let's talk over the first puzzle of the area. The first thing we come across is a door which has different switches we can adjust that make different sounds. This is similar to the sliders we use to get into this area. As we move along, we come across different platforms with buttons, which we can highlight by pressing them. We also see a large satellite above these stations, along with a hanging object of some kind near them. One of the stations has these mysterious singing crystals. As I said, this age technically has no name, but it came to be known as the Selenitic Age, as that's what it's called in the game's files. The word selenite refers to a type of crystal, so I just assume it was probably named after these. Moving onward, we can see a large structure in the center of the lake, with many different satellites sticking out in different directions. We can reach this by going through a short underground tunnel. At the base of the satellite, a panel lets us access 5 different symbols. When we click them, we can move the satellites, which we must align with the sound each of those areas had made. However, the satellites can only do this after we activate the microphones near the objects. The first is the sound of water, near a well at the start of the level. Second is a crack which fire is coming out of. Third is a broken clock. The fourth, a singing crystal. And lastly, the wind coming out of a tunnel. After we do this, we can then align the satellites and press the button on the bottom. This gives us the order we need to put the sounds on the door at the start of the level. I really like the idea behind this puzzle, but I feel it's just a bit too easy. I solved it nearly instantly when I first played the game. The symbols near the sounds immediately give away where we have to point the satellite. If these didn't exist, then we would have to use only our ears to figure out the puzzle. I feel like that would have been much more intuitive and interesting. This was also the last area I did, so it may have been more difficult for me if it had been my first. Which makes me think, since Myst is a game where you can choose which order you want to do the areas in, it's hard to balance each of them equally, as the more you play through, the more you start to catch on to the game's logic. Once we make it through the door, we can finally make it to the underground section. I've been suspending my disbelief a lot while playing this game, but the thought that Atris actually made all of this stuff entirely on his own is a bit of a stretch. There's a really cool looking machine, which we can even walk around and see from different angles. However, depending on who you ask, the sight of this hulking piece of metal may instead bring memories of tedium, frustration, and just overall misery and unhappiness. As we move into its tightly packed, claustrophobic interior, we can press a button which moves us down a track. What we're seeing in the small circular window before us is one of two different views we'll be seeing a lot of down here. They will practically be burned into your eyes by the time you finally leave it. By many players, this is considered one of the most hated puzzles in Myst. But before we decide whether we like it or hate it, let's try to understand it. This area is a gigantic maze. Each time we move, we can go in 8 different directions. Sound plays sometimes when we move to an area. Sometimes there's no sound. When there is a sound, this button next to the controls will play the sound again for us. Most players, once they get to this part, have no idea the correlation between this sound and the directions. They simply go mad in a giant maze, and by brute force and trial and error, find the way to the end. If you remember earlier, I said the initial puzzle to the area, while not very interesting, does actually have a purpose. That purpose, in some sense, is quite brilliant. The theme of every puzzle in this area has been sound, with our goal trying to figure out what the sounds do. Understanding this theme is the game's hint for solving the tram puzzle. So let's go back to the start and try it again. We're taught the way the puzzle works very slowly and intentionally. When we first arrive on the track, a sound plays. As I said earlier, this button on the side will play the sound for us again. On the right-hand side is the direction indicator. Again, as I said earlier, we can go in 8 directions: north, south, east, and west, and all combinations in between. The only direction we can go right now is north, so let's do that. Just for a bit of context, the red light indicates the direction is blocked. When a path is open, we can deliberately see the space in front of us. Next, a different sound plays. We can't go north anymore. We can go south, but that's going backwards. All other directions are blocked except west, so let's go west. Next, we hear the sound we heard when we first needed to go north. This is an important moment as a pattern is being established. The game is telling us, when this sound plays, that means we need to go north. So let's do that. Next, we hear an entirely new sound again. This is the first time we can pick between 2 directions, north or east. Every decision we made before was completely forced. We just established the sound that plays when we need to go north. We haven't gone east yet, and we just heard a new sound. So it's only natural we should go east. The next area plays the same sound again. So let's keep going east. Finally, we can hear the last sound we need, which indicates to go south. We can see by this point that not only does the game try to hint to us this system of corresponding sounds to the directions we need to go, but it also forces us upon a linear path, intuitively teaching us these sounds. One step at a time, the sounds are revealed to us. Sounds we know already are repeated multiple times to give the player more hints and chances to figure out the puzzle. Later in the maze, it's much easier to get lost if we make a mistake. Paths branch out and become more complex, and dead ends lead to more dead ends. Early on, dead ends are short, and we can just backtrack immediately to get to where we were before. The maze also gets more difficult, combining pre-existing sounds to create combined directions. In this example, the sound for west plays, and the sound for south, making this sound for southwest. However, this is totally impossible to figure out unless we understand the basics first. Not only is the maze incredibly thoughtfully designed, but the way that it builds upon this complexity, while also playing off of the thematic hints of the Myst Island and Satellite Puzzle, is incredibly clever. Then despite all of this, why do so many players seem to struggle with this puzzle? As I said, the player doesn't understand the earlier parts of the puzzle. It's impossible to understand the later parts, as it grows in complexity the further you get. If you haven't figured out by the first several moves what the sounds do or their purpose, then you're basically wasting your time, as it's your best chance to understand how it all works. In that sense, I think the puzzle could be improved by somehow forcing the player to replay through the beginning, say by giving them a certain number of moves. If you don't make it to the end and say 20 moves, the player is taken back to the start. That makes the player have to consistently replay through the hints until they figure it out, rather than getting endlessly lost in the maze. Rand Miller is a strong advocate of this puzzle. In his own words, he says, "There was a certain elegance to that puzzle that I think people don't understand. I love the fact that people play through an entire world that has everything to do with sound, and then they go down to this vehicle at the bottom of the world and they forget about it. And we're still giving them sound clues for what to do. The maze is actually laid out along with the sounds, so that it elegantly reveals itself. There's no chance for confusion. If you're listening to the sounds from the very beginning, you will learn the maze." I have to say that Rand's argument is pretty convincing to me. After understanding the puzzle, I feel like it's quite fair, besides what I already said could be improved. It's interesting then to contrast what he says with Robin's thoughts on the puzzle.
Could you please briefly discuss the design process behind the bathysphere?
Of what?
The bathysphere?
Okay, yeah. That was our worst puzzle.
Yes, it was.
We failed on that one, totally. That's the answer. That's one of those arbitrary things we made. That's the worst puzzle in the game. Yes.
But how do you feel about it? I feel like ultimately it can go either way. Regardless, we can finally take a breath of relief as we make it to the end of the maze, which leads us to a linking book, taking us once again back to Myst Island. Back on Myst Island, we start to get a little bit more backstory between the brothers. The mudflinging and accusations really starts to become full force here.
It's so long since my brother, Sirius, wrongfully imprisoned me within this book. Stupid schemes. He's done evil and he has destroyed all before. I need all the red pages. I never. Don't touch the blue pages. For my wicked brother, he is a man of distorted mind and senses. He disgusts me. Do not release Akhenar. Thirst for destruction is not.
I love the way Sirius looks just so visibly disgusted when he thinks about Akhenar. And I mean, can you really blame him? Akhenar looks like he hasn't showered in months. We didn't get any evidence for the Selenitic Age, so there's really not much to speculate on. I haven't had the chance to mention it yet, but the two actors who play Sirius and Akhenar are actually the Miller brothers themselves. I really get the sense of Myst being a labor of love with this, and it really adds to the charm of the game. Robin's resemblance is easier to see, but Rand looks a lot chunkier. And hey, I'm not judging. Game development back in the day was a lot of hard work. Joking aside, I think the reason Rand got so close to the camera is to distort himself a bit. It took me a while to actually pick up that it was him. Now on to the next tower puzzle. If you point the tower at the large cog near the beginning, we get a time of day and the numbers 221. We put these numbers into the clock at the end of the island, which will open up a small bridge, allowing us onto an even smaller island. Inside the clock tower is a contraption with two levers. one which moves the two top numbers, the other which moves the bottom two numbers. This is a great example of an arbitrary puzzle. We're not trying to figure out how this device works as much as we are trying to figure out the correct way to align the numbers on the cogs. But even worse, this puzzle actually can't be solved unless you figure out its gimmick. If we hold down either of the levers as we turn them, we can actually turn the middle number as many times as we want. Pulling a few levers to align some numbers is as arbitrary as a puzzle can get. It's not subtle, and it doesn't really teach us anything about the world of Myst. More of an obstacle designed to block our way. With that, though, we can now go to the top of Myst Island to get to the next area. But before that, let's speak a little bit about its backstory. On Atris's arrival on the island, an old man explains to him its history. A beautiful city once stood above the water, surrounded by 3 mountains. People had no means of traveling on water, so they built a lookout post to attract potential visitors. One day, the sky grew dark, and black ships attacked them, bearing a flag with a dark insignia. Only a handful of people survived, and the city's foundation had been destroyed, causing it to sink. Rumors grew that in 10 years the black ships would return. With 9 years already having passed, Atris set about creating a defensive fortress to help protect the survivors. Him and his sons would construct it, using the ruins of the old city far below the water as its foundation. Once they came, they repelled the attack, but they did not defeat them. The sky remained dark, and the old man explained how they would stay dark until the enemy had been completely destroyed. Atris leaves the age, but not before warning his sons not to risk their lives to end the perpetual darkness that covers the sky. Once we're through, we're immediately met with an elaborate fortress sitting atop a massive cog. Immediately obvious is the distinctive lack of a dark sky which Atris referred to, so we can already tell something's gone on here. There's a small panel next to us with different shapes we can change by pressing the buttons, but we can't do anything with it right now. Moving inside, there's a fork with 2 paths. Let's go left first. Here we come across one of Sirius's rooms again. Much like his Channelwood room, we can feel a real sense of his extravagance and grandeur here. There are some golden models on pedestals, some shaped jewels that light up when we touch them, along with this interesting little wind-up bird. There's even a picture of him here too, which is an edited version of an actual painting of Napoleon. Little bit egotistical. The throne is very elaborate and distinct. On its back is a symbol that almost resembles something like a sun. The Channelwood room used brown and green lining for its theme, but here we get a much more extravagant looking dark marble lined with gold along with dark crimson red. A neat little detail I like is this singular wine glass on the throne arm, giving us a sense that Sirius was never too far away from his wine. I know this game shows a lot of age, but a lot of times I think people are too dismissive of something because it isn't graphically impressive. Sure, the graphics of Myst aren't as good anymore, but when it comes to art direction, the game has an amazing amount of effort put into it. Not only did these rooms have to be drawn up, each object visualized along with mixed and matched to give them unique themes, but since they are also 3D, they would have to be designed with the camera and perspective of the player in mind. Much of this was done by Robin Miller, who not only created the visuals, but set them to the perfect angle. That's exactly how paintings and pictures are designed, and to visualize all of these things takes an enormous amount of creativity and effort. Robin's talent doesn't just stop at the design of the visuals themselves though, he's also responsible for the soundtrack of the game. One interesting thing to note about it is there's a different variation of Sirius's and Akinar's themes depending on which area we are in. For example, the Channelwood variations have some natural drums in the background. Whereas here in the Mechanical Age, we can hear a metallic hit. Back to the game though, there's a hidden compartment to the back of Sirius's room. Some ominous music plays here, and we can see a bunch of chests full of gold, along with another red page. We can finally see where Sirius is keeping all of his wine, but more interestingly is a small letter written to Sirius from Akinar, where he calls Sirius greedy, saying he will tell his subjects not to pay his new tax. We've already gotten hints that the brothers don't like each other, but now we can get a little sense there was some back and forth going on. It's an interesting piece of evidence against Cirrus, but we'll soon see why it's hard to trust. Moving onwards, we make our way to Akinar's room. The floor is scattered with pipes and boards, and weapons line the walls, along with a sinister-looking helmet on top of a chest. There's a little toy just like the one in Cirrus's room, with a snake striking out once you wind it up. Way more macabre. The lighting here too is really ominous. The lookout window is hidden, and a red aura fills the room. The real point of interest here is the trophy on the wall, an unmistakable head of a monkey. It's clear now that Akinar was probably up to no good in Channelwood. Maybe he's the reason it's completely empty. It gets worse though. Like Cirrus's room, we can find a hidden compartment in the back. In a dirty old chest, we can glimpse a severed head of something that's hard to make out. It's probably another monkey. The shelf beside it has a blue page, but also all sorts of what looks to be poisons. Here, there's a gigantic cell with a lever that shocks its victims. After seeing this room, it's pretty damning against Akinar, and it's making Cirrus look like a much better choice. I don't know how he could possibly justify owning a bunch of torture devices, but it almost feels a bit too overt. Lastly, I want to talk about an interesting detail in the room. In Atris's book on Channelwood, he talks about the Monkey King sitting on a throne. Akinar's throne doesn't look normal sized to me. It looks like it would fit a much smaller person. If it wasn't raised with a metal step beneath it, it would be far too small for a normal human. So this makes me think he probably stole this throne from Channelwood, and maybe it's even the Monkey King's head on the wall. This is just a theory, but I thought it's worth pointing out. Now let's turn to this small device in the room, Fortress Rotation Simulator. This is a device to practice a puzzle we'll do later. It takes a little bit of skill using the two levers, but it isn't too difficult. When we hit a direction, we'll actually hear a familiar sound. Do you recognize it? These are the same sounds for the tram in the Selenitic Age. If you're perceptive and you come to this area before that one, you can actually figure out what sound each direction makes from this little device. It's a nice little interesting detail if you do this age first. Moving on, we come to the last part of the level, the elevator. It's closed right now, so we have to press this button on the side and go below. There's a really simple puzzle here where we pull a lever to align two half-open circles. This opens the elevator door, which lets us go to the second floor. Going upstairs gets us stuck, with only one screen we can move forward. But there's nowhere else to go in the fortress. We get a few small hints here to figure out what to do. The back spotlights are pointed outwards, with the close ones being strangely pointed inwards. There's also an arrow pointing upwards on the top of the elevator's frame. If we look up, we can see the controls to help us rotate the fortress. Now we just have to bring it down. There's a curious button between up and down on the elevator. When we press it, there's some kind of delay before the elevator goes down. So how about we press it and leave the elevator? And just like that, we have access to the fortress controls. Now we need to test our rotation skills. If you paid attention on the simulator, you can remember the distinctive sounds that play each time we hit a direction. You can see how fast, though, we're rotating because we can see the cogs in front of us. The rest of the level is just going to the adjacent islands, which have pieces of the code for the panel at the start of the level, making it a rather short and sweet level, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Interesting, I think, how the level uses the cogs and their rotation as its theme. The fortress sits on a giant cog, along with them being strewn about the remaining islands. Panels are shaped like cogs. We even entered the level in a giant cog. Since the fortress was built on the foundation of the sunken city, it seems like the cogs were a leftover remnant of that civilization. Speaking of the lore, as I mentioned at the start of the age, we can immediately notice the lack of a dark sky which symbolized the impending threat of the black ships. If we rotate the fortress at a certain angle and use the telescope in Sirius's room, we can actually see a sunken ship along with a hanging skeleton. Presumably this is the pirates the book talks about, so we can assume the threat has been ended. There's no trace of the remaining survivors which Atris talks about, so that only leaves either Sirius, Achenar, or both to have done something to them. After we get all the codes, we return to the panel at the start of the level, taking our 4th page with us back to Myst. By this point, the evidence against Achenar is stacking up pretty strongly. I have to say that his face contorting and getting red may be a cool party trick, but it's not doing him any favors in looking innocent. Sirius is seeming like a more appealing option, although he does come off as a bit pompous. I'm leaning towards him until I have more to go off of. Their dialogue from the 4th page gives a little bit of more insight on the situation on Myst, as well as the obligatory mudflinging.
Convinced the Sirius is guilty. Pray, do not release him. You have observed his unbridled lust for riches. Final blow to father. You tricked him into believing that it was I who was the murderer. I didn't murder father. My brother Achenar is demented. He is guilty. Took advantage of the freedom our father had given us. Achenar guilty. He will destroy both myself and you, just as he destroyed the other creatures of Myst.
Moving on, let's get to the next puzzle. We just have to put some dates into this machine in the planetarium. Then highlight the correct stones at the center of the island. This raises the ship that was sunk at the dock of the island. It's kind of a boring puzzle, mostly just inserting information, not really worth explaining much in depth. Finally, we come to the last age of our playthrough, and my personal favorite, the Stoneship Age. When Atris arrives on the island, he befriends 3 boys which live on a cluster of rocks stranded in the middle of the ocean. Curiously, Atris notes that the boys are afraid of the rain. As time passes, Atris sees a light source in the distance, which he suspects are other people. He decides to build a lighthouse of his own on the island, which attracts several others to it. Satisfied with his work, he leaves for 10 whole years. When he returns, the boys have turned into men. He's told the rain has subsided for 7 whole years. The lighthouse is in perfect condition, though he notes that the island has sunken somewhat. The entry ends with Atris supposing what will happen here in another 10 years. We'll come back to this lore and analyze it later. For now, let's look at this curious contraption at the start of the level. There are 3 different buttons, and the noise each makes sound like some type of engine. For now, we're going to leave this off. To our right is the lighthouse Atris talks about in his book. Inside there's a key and a locked door above. You can move the key, but it's attached to the ground. So it seems we need some way to break the chain. If we turn around, we can see a single plank poke out of the water. This is one of my favorite little hints in the game. I'll explain why. Going back outside the lighthouse, there are a few details that draw the player's attention. Do you notice anything off? It's very subtle, to the point that you may not notice it. If you remember in the book, Atris talks about the water level rising on the island. The path to the lighthouse is makeshift planks, along with the window pane being shattered. We're actually entering the lighthouse from an upper floor, through its window. From there, it reasons to say this single plank sticking out is most likely a stairstep to the lower levels. Keep this in mind as we go through the level. Heading up to the top of the island, we get to a vantage point with a telescope. I really like this spot. It's really atmospheric with the wind blowing, and the music is just perfect. The only issue is that when we use the telescope, all the other sounds stop, completely sucking all immersion out of the moment. I think this may have had something to do with the technological limitations at the time. Coming back down from the top, we can see various tunnel entrances that are flooded. There's nowhere else we can go, so let's take a look at that weird contraption again at the start. I like how looking at the machine, there's no obvious explanation for what it might do. The sound it makes when you press a button ends up making a lot of sense when you realize that it's pumping water. This is another one of those really natural puzzles that unveils itself differently for each player. Each button pumps water out of one of the 3 submerged areas. The player is likely to leave one of the buttons on, and then they'll naturally discover, through trial and error, what's opening the areas is related to this machine. So it's a real aha moment when you finally figure out what it's doing. Let's look at the first submerged area, the underwater ship first. Though it's completely dark down here, the faint blue light of the sun through the water gives the player just enough visibility to move around. The way the light hits the railing in this shot is real picturesque, along with the angle on the way up the passage. This kind of heavy contrasting lighting in games is something I really feel you don't see much anymore, but it seemed really popular in a lot of these older early 3D games. We can't do anything down here just yet, so let's go to the next area. The second button drains the flooded tunnels on the island. At the bottom, a hidden door reveals a theme that's all too familiar to us by now. This is one of the most beautiful and elaborate rooms in the game. The theme here of red and green and gold is just really visually pleasing to the eyes. The vases and columns are ornate and intricate, and everything is patterned, from the dressers to the bed sheets to the bed frame. The room is just really full of detail. There's a few odd doodads here. These spinning globes, and this weird geometric thingamajig that really reminds me of early computer graphics. The left drawer in the room has a bunch of miscellaneous items in it. Valuable looking gems, dining utensils, and also a red page. Far more interesting, however, is the desk on the right side of the room. Here we can see a collection of bottles, pills, and a syringe. We've already seen that Cirrus is a bit of a drinker, but throwing drugs into the mix too does make him a little more suspicious. Next we go to the other hallway, which is no longer flooded, and reach Akinar's room. This is the most detailed of his rooms in the game, the lighting being particularly praiseworthy. On top of being really creepy, the light within the ribcage creates a real interesting effect with the shadows. Here we can see these faces, which look quite similar to the faces on the walls we saw in Channelwood. There's a drawer with a weird contraption on top. It shows a rose which turns to a skull as we move the lever. Yeah, real subtle, Akinar. The drawers themselves don't seem to have much notable in them. There is some maps though. Like the paintings around the game, these are probably something like historical maps, I'm not exactly sure. But I think the implication here is that the brothers have been sailing around, and that's how they came to this island. There's more evidence of this later. In the bottom drawer, we do get the other half of the ripped note we found in Channelwood, but we're not going to talk about it just yet. Though Akinar's rooms have been much simpler than Cirrus's, I will say that they do well to portray what type of person he is. The only problem is that it lacks any sort of subtlety and he just seems very clearly evil. We have to remember though that at the time of its release, the idea of telling a story through the environment of the game was a rather novel one. I'm not claiming Myst was the first game to do this, but it may be one of the first games that did it so well, even if it isn't perfect. Akinar is pretty obviously depraved, but the way that we're shown it through him sleeping on a bed frame, to seeing his obsession with macabre things, is still pretty interesting and unsettling, I think. There's another theory I have for why Akinar is so apparently evil, but again, it's something I'm going to come back to later. Now let's go back to the pump and press the last button, and solve what's probably my favorite puzzle in the game. Going back to the lighthouse, the plank we saw earlier reveals itself, now as a stairwell. At the bottom, there's a locked chest with a knob on its side, which if we interact with, drains the water from inside the chest. At this moment, we have all of the parts we need to solve this puzzle. A locked chest, a key, a pump, and the knob to drain the chest. We just need to play around with it until everything clicks. Looking at the key again, when we click it, we can see we're not pulling it away per se, but clearly moving it towards something. It stands to reason we need to somehow get the chest up so we can use the key on it. Let's set the pump to a different option, to fill the lighthouse again with water. But returning, it doesn't float up. Our hint for getting it to float up was the water that poured out of the chest when we pulled the knob. Water was already in the chest, which is why it wasn't floating up in the first place. So we need to close this knob so that it can be filled with air, thus floating up and reaching the key. This isn't the hardest puzzle in the game, but I just think the way it's designed is so layered and makes so much intuitive and logical sense. Which makes me think it's very ironic how solving the puzzle can make so much sense, but the pieces of the puzzle, like the key being bolted to the ground or the chest being stuck beneath the lighthouse, really don't make any sense at all. I think conceptually, this is why the Miller Brothers' idea of a non-arbitrary puzzle works. I think our belief gets suspended when we do intuitive things like this. Many things in the real world simply operate with us barely understanding them. Say things like cars or even computers. It's something about our brains, maybe, that we care less about how or why something works, and instead just focus on making it work at all. After reaching the top of the lighthouse, we can now turn a crank which will power a battery. This lights the tunnels that lead to each of the brothers' rooms. There's a secret passage along the walls of the tunnels, which leads us into a room with a compass with many buttons. The last connection we have to make here is to take the number of the degree on the lighthouse from the telescope and put it here to turn the lights on to the underground section from the start of the area. From here, all that's left to do is to interact with the table at the end, causing the Myst book to appear and return to Myst. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about this area's backstory, as it's quite interesting. Let's start from the beginning and piece things together bit by bit. The Mechanical Age gives us some hints to solve the mystery of the disappearing people in the Stoneship Age. If you remember in the Mechanical Age, Aegis helped build a fortress for a group of people who were attacked by black ships. The sky was perpetually dark and stormy, and after repelling the ship's attacks, an old man would tell Atris that it would remain that way until the black ships were defeated. Let's go back to the Stoneship Age. When Atris came to this islet of rocks, he met several boys. Obviously they aren't here now, so there must be an explanation for their disappearance. Atris says that the boys were afraid of the rain, and as the story goes on, more people seemingly swim to the rocks, though we don't know from where or why. But I think we can come up with a basic theory as to what's happening here. The black ships are likely sailing around the sea, terrorizing anyone they can find. The people swimming to the rocks could potentially be survivors who swam from other islands to escape the black ships. This theory gets more interesting as we find an incriminating piece of evidence against Cirrus. A small cloth bears the same insignia of the pirates in the dresser in his room. We also learn from Atris's book that the boys initially lived on the caves of the island, those caves which are now the home to Cirrus and Akinar's rooms. So from this we can guess that both the brothers had allied at some point with the black ships and taken the island for themselves. There's one last piece to the puzzle though, while seemingly harmless, sealed the nail in the coffin for the people of the Stoneship Age. Atris talks about seeing a light in the far distance, but she isn't sure if it's people or some sort of natural phenomena. This prompts Atris to come up with the idea to build a lighthouse for the island. And it's at this point that you may come to the stark realization. A lighthouse more than likely attracted the black ships, ultimately getting the island's inhabitants killed. With the final age completed, we can bring the last pages to Cirrus and Akinar, where each of them presents us with a different story of what happened to the ages and the library of Myst. Akinar accuses Cirrus of proclaiming himself king of the ages of Myst, killing the inhabitants and destroying the remaining books.
It began when my brother Cirrus began to lust for riches. He stole from the ages of Myst. He hoarded riches for himself. My father father swept away his watchfulness. My sick brother secretly pronounced himself king. King of the ages of Myst, he said. And then Cirrus began to destroy the ages of Myst. He burned their forest. He tore down their structures. He flooded their lands. He murdered their inhabitants. He destroyed all but 4 of the ages.
He then says Cirrus tried to kill him, but Atreus trapped them both in the books before his death. Cirrus's dialogue is more interesting, as he reveals a lot of details to us.
His father was a master of the books. He wrote hundreds of them, all describing and linking to the fantastic places and ages which he had discovered. The room in which you now stand was our father's library. It was here, in this room, on this island named Myst, that he housed most of these books. Our father was always watchful of our exploration. We grew up under his strict supervision. But when we came of age, he gave us unbridled access to the Myst books. He began to leave our adventures more and more unchecked. Unsupervised as we were, my brother began to become disturbed. He had completely destroyed all of the Myst ages but 4. I wasted no time. In warning my father, I thought he would recognize Achena's guilt. But in a fit of rage, he imprisoned both my brother and myself within the pages of these books, designed to hold us until he could judge which of us was guilty. To discover the truth, our father embarked on one final chapter. However, he has never returned. I can only assume that he perished along the way, leaving me, an innocent victim, trapped forever. But now, you are here to release me.
At this point, both Cirrus and Achenar give us a code to a secret book hidden on the bookshelf. If you remember at the beginning of the video, I talked about how the game can be completed in less than a minute, and this is why. All you need to know to beat the game is where this book is and which code to use in it on the fireplace. If you've actually made it this far through the video, I want to give a personal thanks to you. It means a lot to me. You're a real patient person, and that's a good quality. After inputting the code on the panel, we get the last pages and a mysterious green book. Both of the brothers warn us against using the green book, as it's a trap likely similar to the books the brothers are already trapped in themselves. At this point, we can choose our ending. If we use the blue page, it frees Achenar, and if we use the red page, it frees Cirrus. Alternatively, we can go for the third option, the green book. It's pretty clear that Achenar is hard to trust. All the obsession with death and his pretty overtly psychopathic behavior. Cirrus comes off as much more civilized, but he seems to have a drug and drinking problem, with the insignia of the Black Flag really giving him away. But I think, interestingly, the third option isn't exactly appealing to us either. Considering both brothers insist on the green book being a trap, you would think that they wouldn't want us to see inside it. But if you really think about it, it's impossible to tell if that's true or not, because if it was a trap, they also wouldn't want us to use it, as we're their only way to freedom. If you want to make your own guess, now's the time to do it. What do you think is the best choice?
Convinced that Cirrus is guilty. Pray, do not release him. Bring that page to me, and I will finally be released. Remember, take the red page. Only the blue page. Ignore the blue page. It chills me to even think what would happen if you were to release him. You're wasting my time, and yours. Just get the blue page.
The first time I played the game, I really felt there's no way Achenar can seriously be evil. It had to be a twist of some kind. I mean, he's got all those weapons and torture devices, and never washes his face, let alone his bed sheets. Well, I guess let's see how this goes.
And how do you feel, my friend? Oh, but ever here? Perhaps pages you work so hard for? What?
What was Rand smoking when he did this scene? So yeah, with Akanar, what you see is exactly what you get. His behavior is completely deranged. No surprises here.
Maybe someone will rescue you someday.
As said before, the insignia of the Black Flag is quite a nail in the coffin for Cirrus. Again, the cutscene speaks for itself. This is really peak 90s FMV acting.
Oh, yes! Yes.
I didn't walk in on anything, did I?
Thank you, my friend. My dear friend. You've done the right thing. You stupid fool! It looks like perhaps you're in the book now.
The only surprising thing about this cutscene is I could have swore Cirrus was bald.
Goodbye.
Finally, we have the last option, and if you paid enough attention throughout the game, it's really the only one you can choose. Here we can meet the final player to tie everything together on the mystery of Myst.
Who the devil are you? Don't come here to Dunny. Not yet. I have many questions for you, my friend. Perhaps my story is in order. My name is Atris. I fear you've met my sons, Cirrus and Akanar, in the red and blue books on Myst Island, in my library. I wrote many books that linked me to fantastic places. It's an art I learned from my father many years ago. Oh, but the red and blue books, those were different. I wrote those books to entrap over-greedy explorers that might stumble upon my island of Myst. But I had no idea my own sons would be entrapped. I gave them free rein to the books. Perhaps it was not wise. I could see the greed growing in them. I had not told them about the red and blue books. They begged me for access to those books, and I, of course, denied them. Oh, they devised a plan. An evil plan. I had no idea to what extent their greed had progressed. Of course, I could return to Myst, except that they removed a single page from my Myst linking book. I cannot return without that page. You, my friend, can bring that page to me. I could go to Myst and bring justice to my sons for what they have done.
And with that, we found Atris and uncovered the truth about the story behind Myst. I have to say that though the game is full of cheesy acting, this cutscene does feel a bit touching to me. You really get the sense that Atris regrets and feels sad about his sons, and I feel bad for him. As he said, we need to go find and bring him a page which lets him return to Myst. We can get a pretty funny interaction if we just go straight into Dunny without the page.
You return. We meet face to face. And the page, did you bring the page?
Nah, I didn't.
You didn't bring the page. You didn't bring the page. Who are you? Oh. Did you not take my warning seriously?
Nope.
Welcome to Dunny. You and I will live here. Forever.
Damn. That sucks. Well, I guess I'll call Top Bunk. So anyways, we need to find the Myst linking page to help Atris get back to Myst. This is where those two page halves we found come in handy. One we found in Channelwood, the other in Stoneship. The message tells us that we need to align the switches on Myst Island to find the small compartment the page is in. Then for like the 100th time, I have to input this code into the fireplace. Seriously, I've done this so many times for this video. Then finally, we can hand it over to Atris.
Give me the page. Please give the page. You've done the right thing. I have a difficult choice to make. My sons have betrayed me. I know what I must do. I shall return shortly. It is done. I have many questions for you, my friend, but my writing cannot wait. Oh, in reward, I'm sorry, but all I have to offer you is the library on the island of Myst, the books that are contained there. Feel free to explore at your leisure. I hope you find your explorations satisfying. You will no longer have my sons to deal with.
After we arrive back in the library, the books are destroyed, with Atris ultimately deciding his sons have caused too much destruction and cannot be redeemed. When you really think about it, the only ages we see are the ones that haven't been completely destroyed. We only get such a brief glimpse of the mayhem the brothers have caused throughout the game, there being only 4 ages left. We never speak to or see a single person spoken about by Atris in his books, other than his sons. Everyone is presumably dead or fled their tyrannical behavior. The death of the brothers is a grim ending, the only real logical choice. With that, we've finally completed Myst. If you remember at the start of the game, I explained that the Miller brothers strived to create a more mature story for Myst, and how they wanted the game to have a moral decision the player has to make. I think it's time then to ask if they really succeeded at this goal, and ultimately I have to say that yes, I think they did. While Myst doesn't have the most complex story, or even the most subtle, it sufficiently adds confusion along with leaving clues to the brothers' true natures throughout the levels, so that the player can come to the truth themselves. I think Akinar serves as mostly a red herring. He's very clearly evil through the things we find out about him. This makes Cirrus seem more like the appealing option, but in truth, Cirrus only has one overt damning clue about him. While he does seem greedy and a bit hedonistic, I don't think outright that means it makes sense to say he's guilty just for those reasons. When it comes to the end and we're faced with our 3 options, the Green Book is a complete wild card that could honestly have anything within it. Choosing it is a risky option, and there's no hints as to what could be behind it. But if we believe what we see, the hints throughout the world tell us enough to know that we have no choice but to choose it. I don't mean to make this sound like the most interesting decision ever. Could have been made better, sure, and Myst is far from a perfect game. But let's put it in its context a bit. Myst's largest direct competitor in 1993 would be a game called Seventh Guest. Just like Myst, it would use the same graphical style, while also having a storyline focused on a more mature audience. Together with Doom, these 3 games would combine to drive the sales for the newly introduced CD-ROM format available to computers. However, as time would go on, the Seventh Guest would fade into obscurity, while Myst would continue to grow and grow. It would branch out into a franchise, adapting countless sequels, being re-released and even remade as far as into 2021. So what was it about Myst that caused it to edge out over its direct competitor, despite both being so successful? One distinction about Myst that I think makes it uniquely mature is the fact that it doesn't treat its audience like they are stupid. For the majority of the game, we barely even have a motive, just solving puzzles at our leisure and collecting stray pages we find in these worlds. While Seventh Guest would focus more on straightforward puzzles, the fresh and interesting idea of a non-arbitrary puzzle, along with a lore that is shrouded in mystery, it really treats its players as intelligent and capable of solving things on their own. This isn't to say, by the way, that arbitrary puzzles are bad per se. If I made that statement, I would basically be saying that the majority of puzzles in games are bad, as overwhelmingly, logic puzzles are the standard. I'm only pointing out that the approach that Myst does is special, and it gives the game its own unique flavor. Myst won't win any awards for the most compelling plot or universe. It has some amazing puzzles, but some are also quite mediocre. What Myst does provide is its own one-of-a-kind identity. A mysterious, immersive world, a cohesive one that brings together many different concepts that were not being drawn on at its time, and even in the modern day are being replicated not nearly as well. There is no other game like Myst. That is why it has eclipsed its competitors, leaving them in the dust to still be celebrated decades later.